Hello. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Before we begin, I want to thank ATC Research. They're not a sponsor or anything, but they helped me a huge amount with data collection for this. Made it possible for me to do a lot of the data analysis in this. They spent a huge amount of time doing it. If you are in the development space or in the development consultancy space in Los Angeles, I recommend you check out the tool they have. I find it really helpful, and I think it's a really great service and they're incredibly helpful. Hello, welcome. My name is Joseph May. You probably know me better as Joe Cohen. That's a Twitter persona that I created about a year and a half ago. I've had a Twitter account since I was in middle school and decided to create an account just to talk about real estate development initially, then sort of expanded it to encompass more of my personality. And this is sort of my first time officially in a public place acknowledging that that's who I am online. So hello, my real name is Joseph May. Why housing? Why do I care so much about this issue? A couple of reasons. One of them is that this is something that I think causes so much suffering and there's just so much unnecessary unpleasantness just for something that's relatively easily solvable, something that's a problem that is our own creation. I also think that with climate change, we're going to see a huge shift in migration patterns and a huge amount of population displacement that is going to likely require significantly rethinking how our cities operate, and we need to be able to build to be able to accommodate that for it not to be a disaster. And I think it's really important as a species that we get better at building cities and accommodating for growing populations. So today I'm going to present, the one and only solution to the housing crisis in Los Angeles. Of course, that's a joke. This is an incredibly complicated problem. There's problems with zoning, there's problems with finance, there's problems with the relationships of different parties within finance. There's problems with how developers think about their relationship to tenants. There's construction codes. There's so many different issues that need to be solved around housing. I'm going to touch on a few of them. There's always going to be more work to do in this space, but we need to start somewhere. The two main things that I'm going to be talking about today. One is zoning. We have a housing crisis because it's too expensive, risky, and time-consuming to build housing. And the reason we got to this place is because of zoning. As I mentioned earlier, zoning is far from the only thing we need to solve, but it's a necessary prerequisite to being able to solve the housing crisis. Then the second thing I'm going to talk about is a project that I've been working on for the past number of months in this space to help with some of the other issues and to solve the kind of specific problem that's the personal project I've been working on. A little bit about me, my background. I'm from Hollywood, but not Hollywood, California. I'm not from Los Angeles, I'm from Florida. Grew up in a great family, living in the suburbs though. My parents had to drive me to go anywhere. Up front, that's my bias. I'm a bit anti-suburbs just because I grew up in that environment, felt very isolated. I do understand that is an environment that a lot of people do like. I moved out to Los Angeles to go to school at University of Southern California. I was in the first class of the Iveen Young Academy, which is a program that was started by Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iveen, combines business engineering and design. So my background is kind of a tech startup background. When I was in middle school, I got really interested in the concept of augmented reality. And freshman year at USC, I took a class on refractive discs and started attending some conferences on this tech. And before my sophomore year, I started an augmented reality headset company. By the end of my junior year, we had raised money from some of the top investors in Silicon Valley. We had gotten a manufacturing plant almost up and running. It was great, and then I got kicked out of the company. So I was starting my senior year of college. I had a thesis project that I had to do, and suddenly what I was focused on and what my whole life had been going around was gone. And I was like, okay, I need to choose a new topic. Decided to choose something that I was really interested in, which was housing. So I did my thesis project on LA housing crisis. Originally had this really, looking back, funny, to kind of laugh at how naive I was, this really ridiculous idea for building a whole new car-free neighborhood that's on top of a platform like Hudson Yards, and then I ran the numbers on it and realized it was just financially impossible. Then after that, I stepped back and started looking at the root causes of the housing crisis. This was 5 or 6 years ago, 2017, 2018. That's when I started really getting into housing policy, and it's been something that has captured me ever since, and been, even as I've done different things in different places, the LA housing crisis has been my focus ever since. So let's get started. There's a lot of different places that you can come to as the origin of Los Angeles' housing crisis. You can talk about the forced zoning ordinance that was one of the forced zoning ordinances in the country, I think around 1905. You can talk about the 1930 zoning code, which is actually essentially still the same zoning code we use today, just been edited over the years, but the structure is the same as the 1931. You can talk about in 1934 when we instituted basically redlining in response to the Federal Housing Administration requirements. We took the zoning code and added redlining and setbacks to it. But I think the real origin of the major issues we're experiencing today, the primary cause of it is the downzonings that took place from the 1960s to the 1980s. This graph shows the capacity of the city, and that very much tells the story right there. We used to have zoning to allow for a lot of housing. You could generally build multifamily housing in most of the city, and then we stopped allowing it. And you can see this reflected very well in the number of homes that have gotten built each decade. Except for during World War II, it's gone down basically every subsequent decade as we've used up that capacity of what it got down to. Then you notice this bar on the right. What is that? That is regional housing needs assessment. So every 8 years, the state assigns to each region in the state a housing target that needs to be built by that region. Then all the cities and counties in that region get together and allocate those targets among the different jurisdictions. For this last cycle, which started in 2021, the numbers of required homes to accommodate for are much higher. So the bottom row is County of Los Angeles. It's inclusive of all the cities, including the City of Los Angeles. That got the bulk of the homes required in the region, and then the City of Los Angeles got the bulk, but half of the homes that need to be built in the County of Los Angeles. Once these numbers are doled out to each city, then the cities need to put together a plan for how they're going to accommodate that. And one of the first steps is looking at the current zoning and current land use regulations and saying, how many homes can we accommodate? This is easier said than done, and I'm going to use this as an example to show some of the complexity here. And this is a simplified example of the complexity, but you have these two lots that both have the same zoning and they're the same size lots. They both have a zone capacity once you add bonuses in of 23 units. What would you say is the remaining usable, realistic development capacity of these two? One more simple strategy that a lot of cities utilize is just subtracting the second number from the first number. But you look at the lot on the left, that has a building there with 14 units. You'd be crazy to knock that down to build a 23-unit building, right? You would lose a massive amount of money. Whereas the lot on the right, it's only a 4-unit building. That might potentially could make economic sense to knock down, build a new building. And there's also a big empty portion in the back. You could potentially add a second building there. So if I was doing this analysis, just looking at these two lots, didn't need to do more complex analysis than that, I'd say the green lot has basically a realistic capacity under the zoning of 0, and then the blue lot would be, you just subtract the 4 from the 23. In reality, what the city did, they couldn't decide between working with USC and UCLA, so they went with Berkeley. They developed a very complicated methodology and a regression model that looked at the realistic development capacity, looked at a whole bunch of different factors, and these are the actual numbers they came up with for these sites. Regression models are very confusing. It incorporates a statistical probability of each site being developed, which is why it's weird. So the green one got 0.11 and the blue one got 0.59. So when this was done, this method was applied to all of the parcels on the city. It found that we have a shortfall of about 255,000 units, that we don't have the zoning to accommodate those units. So the state's housing law requires us then to put together a plan to rezone for. The city put a lot of effort into this, came out with a whole bunch of different strategies, and if all these strategies were implemented how they said in the plan, it would lead to a grand total zoning to accommodate an additional over the current zoning of 1.4 million units. Of course, we know from looking at all y'all, this isn't actually going to lead to 1.4 million units being built. This, probably maybe 1, 2, 3% of that would actually get built, but that would be enough to accommodate our housing needs. However, there is starting to be a lot of opposition to this rezoning now that we're actually getting to the point where we're about a year and a half away from actually paying attention to this. What I'm worried about, and I think a lot of people are worried about, is that there's going to be a lot of pressure from anti-housing activists to only hit the minimum number. So we have a shortfall of 255,000 units. Say, let's only zone for capacity of 255 additional units. We know that that is setting ourselves up for failure, right? We know that we're not going to get 100% of the capacity developed. We don't necessarily need to zone for 1.4 million new units. I think there's a reasonable argument to say that a lower number is sufficient, but we know that just the minimum number is not going to actually do really much of anything. So there are serious consequences if we don't take this process seriously and we don't rezone to accommodate the housing that we need. One of the big ones is loss of affordable housing funding. Now, that might not be something that some of these NIMBYs actually care about, even though they say they care about it, but they probably do care about housing element being decertified, which would subject us to builder's remedy, which basically means that any development with at least 20% affordable in any place in the city, so any single family neighborhood, you could build a 50-foot tall tower and there's nothing the city can do to stop it. And that could happen if our housing element is decertified. I have joked around in the past with some city officials like, oh, I should threaten to sue the city to decertify the housing element so they take this more seriously. I wasn't actually going to do that. I recently found out there was a group that has been raising money with the anticipation that we're going to mess this up, and then they're going to sue the city to try and decertify the housing element. So this is actually a serious thing we might be facing. And as fun as that chaos might be, and in a fantasy land, if you're really pro-housing, pro-development, that might be great. Let's not get to that point, right? Let's put together a plan, get rezoning done to accommodate the housing we need, rather than leaving it up to the courts and having years of lawsuits and costing the city millions of dollars to have this free-for-all. One more topic before I start to get into the specific rezoning strategies is the idea of targeted versus broad upzoning. The strategies included in the housing element were generally very targeted. And I think in an ideal world, targeted zoning strategies are great. You can customize things for each individual neighborhood, really get a better evolution of city fabric. But the thing with targeted zoning strategies is they are way more likely to be defeated by opposition because you're pointing to specific parcels and saying we are upzoning these versus something that applies citywide. It's much easier to defeat that with a broad pro-housing coalition. So I generally, even though I know a lot of people in the planning profession, a lot of people in the city prefer very targeted strategies, I believe that when it comes to the RENA rezonings to be successful, we'll much more likely be successful if we use way more broad-based strategies. Some strategic goals, in addition to just the housing numbers behind some of the three strategies I'm going to present. One is actively encouraging home building in LA and making it a place where developers and home builders actually want to build. LA has a reputation for being a really tough city to walk in and a tough city to build in. I don't think that reputation is necessarily as true as people think it is. Like, it is tough, but not nearly as tough as San Francisco or even Austin is. But to build the number of houses that we need to build, we're going to need a lot more developers to be in LA, to work in LA. And for that to happen, we need to have an environment where they're willing and want to be able to work. Another thing is making it possible to build affordable housing. I think a lot of developers would like to be able to build affordable housing. When I'm saying affordable, I mean naturally affordable, non-subsidized, not talking about government subsidized housing here. Developers would want to build more affordable housing. There's a larger market for affordable housing. You know, you can have the economy can get worse and you're not worried about the top of the market dropping off and your pro forma getting ruined. But it needs to be possible for that to happen. So these strategies incorporate a lot of ways of making it profitable for developers to build affordable housing. And then the final one is increased homeownership. Whether or not you think homeownership is ultimately good for society, America bases a lot of social structures around the idea of homeownership. And as long as we have this in place, it would be good to be able to have more housing for homeowners. LA has the highest rental percentage of any major city in the United States, and most of our housing and zoning programs are targeted just towards rental housing. And so that is something that was incorporated when designing these strategies. So the three programs that I'm proposing, one is mid-scale infill using a strategy called under-market upzoning, designed for affordable housing in neighborhoods already zoned for multifamily residential. Then large-scale corridors for mixed-income housing, especially along the west side, and then small-scale homeownership across the city to get incremental density in R1 neighborhoods. Let's start talking about mid-scale infill. You often hear the statistic that 73% of LA is zoned for single family. And while that's technically true, you look at the land in the city of LA, first of all, you have the Santa Monica Mountains, and then a lot of the city is in the valley and really is only part of the city of LA for water rights reasons. And if you actually look at the urban core of Los Angeles, a huge percentage of it is zoned towards multifamily rather than single family. But the problem here, so this is a snapshot of a portion of the core of Los Angeles. This is showing just areas with multifamily zoning. And then look at here. The only places you can build apartment buildings with the base zoning is the pink. A majority of the multifamily zone land in Los Angeles is only zoned with enough density for duplexes to quadplexes. And most of that land is already built with duplexes or quadplexes. So even though it is zoned multifamily, you can't build any more on it than what's already built. And as a result, that land is basically just frozen in time and has been for decades. So should we upzone that land? And in theory, yes, that's great. We should just upzone it, and that would provide a lot more land that's open to development. One thing to consider, however, is that a lot of this land is generally some of the lower priced land in the city, and the pricing of land does not follow typical supply and demand dynamics because land is a finite resource, right? You're not making any more land. Because of that, when you increase the profit that can be made off land, the price of the land generally tends to rise in accordance with that, and without actually developing the landowners gets the benefit of the increase in profit potential. So how do we solve this? As some Georgists will probably tell you, a land value tax can solve this. But politically, a land value tax is not at all feasible in California anytime soon. So we need to look at some other strategies if we're trying to maximize in a very short period of time the amount of housing and the amount of affordable housing that gets built. We need to look at some very specific strategies. One strategy is something called under-market upzoning. The idea of this is an upzoning program that allows developers to build housing, but only if it is priced at lower rents where it is profitable at those rents with the current land prices. So the idea is that if land prices were to increase, then the development at the allowed rents is no longer profitable, so that by just holding on to that land, it no longer increases in value, so that incentivizes actually actively developing it rather than holding it for speculation. And we actually have a program doing this right now that has been incredibly successful. This is a combination of the state's C1G provision of the density bonus, which provides unlimited density for 100% affordable projects, and then LAHPI's Executive Directive 1, which provides for a streamlined approval process and lower fees for 100% affordable projects. This program's been great. We should make it permanent. There was a lawsuit announced today from a group that calls themselves Save the City. They blocked the Hollywood Community Plan, they're a huge nuisance. So they are arguing that this is, I don't say unconstitutional, that's not the right word, but they argue this is illegal, so that's going to be a fight coming up, and if we made this a permanent ordinance, that would get that lawsuit to go away. But there's also some limits to ED1. Specifically, there's a minimum threshold of density to qualify for E1G, and some of those multifamily parcels qualify. The ones in blue qualify 100% affordable projects, but the ones in red don't. So you cannot build 100% affordable on all those red parcels there, which is just dumb, right? Like, we should be allowing 100% affordable housing. It's not controversial to allow 100% affordable housing on multifamily parcels through the city. And this exists because it's just an oversight, right? Like, it's how the laws interact with each other, and it's a relatively simple problem to fix. So the two proposals relate to the mid-scale infill. One is to make ED1 permanent. There is an ordinance out there to do that, but it contains some poison pills that basically would kill most ED1 projects. So we want to advocate, October 11th is a public hearing. We want to advocate for those poison pills to be taken out, but to make ED1 permanent. And the other is to institute an affordable housing overlay to apply on all lots above 5,000 square feet that have R2, RD3, RD2, or RD1.5 zoning that allows a base density of 5 units so that it is compatible to build 100% affordable projects under B1G. So what is the consequence of this? What would this mean if that goes into effect? Today, of these lower density multifamily sites, there are around 18,000 lots in the city that are economically feasible to redevelop into 100% affordable housing. And so economically feasible basically means it applies, and also its existing use is low enough value and the replacement units required are 3 or under, so that it actually could make financial sense to redevelop it. With my proposed extension, that would go up to over 71,000 lots. That's pretty huge increase, and the effect that would have an enabling infill 100% affordable project is just astronomical. If 1% of those lots get developed, which I think we can get a lot more than 1% of those lots developed, it would produce more affordable housing than the city has produced in the past decade. And that's just for a very minor tweak. So that's my first policy proposal. So now let's get to a large-scale corridors. The problem here I'm solving is the west side. More specifically, Los Angeles is very segregated. We have neighborhoods with very high concentrations of poverty and neighborhoods with high concentrations of opportunity, but very little housing that is affordable to anyone who is not very wealthy. And part of state housing laws, as part of the housing element process, the city was required to analyze this and provide for strategies to overcome it. And this has to be my favorite term that's used for this, affirmatively furthering fair housing. It just rolls off the tongue. So for our affirmatively furthering fair housing goals, basically the city said we'd solve this by building a whole bunch of affordable housing on the west side. That's great, right? Except practically how are we going to achieve that? Land on the west side, this is not actually on the west side, but I couldn't find very many large parcels currently for sale. But like this is by the Grove, this is in an affluent area of the city. Land on the west side is very expensive. Not even looking at west side land costs with private development costs to build our affordable housing goals would cost around $74 billion. If you look at public funding for building affordable housing, the funding that's coming from the federal government for the entire state of California, I can find good statistics for Los Angeles, entire state of California is about $4 billion a year, much lower for the city of Los Angeles. And yes, there are state programs and local programs, but like, we don't have nearly enough government money going into this. And yes, I'm advocating for more government money, but we can't just wish that that happens and expect that it solves our problems. We need to have ways for privately funded affordable housing development. With the B1G E1 strategy, that's something to get it in neighborhoods with lower priced land, but that's not going to be very effective on the west side. A strategy that's often employed, we're going to talk about here, is something called inclusionary zoning. And basically, this is maybe a bit of different framing than normally given. We start out by saying, take the base density, the development potential that's allowed by the zoning on the land, and let's say here, telling developers, build half of that as affordable. And then, the other half you can build as luxury market rate housing. Well, that, if you just have that alone, that's going to lose the developer money, right? The cost to build and to maintain the affordable housing is just not going to be made up by the profits on the market rate housing bit. And so then you say, okay, we'll give you additional density to build additional market rate housing units until you get to the point where you can subsidize all the affordable units you're building and then also make a profit. This strategy is called inclusionary housing, or often density bonuses. We have a very effective program in Los Angeles that's about, I think, 6 or 7 years old called TOC. It's great, but it's going to be usurped by a state law, so it's going to basically become useless because there's just going to be state laws that are going to be more effective at achieving the same goals. What I'm proposing here is a new program that I call the Density Inclusion Program that would, I believe, result in a lot more affordable housing getting built in these projects, but also result in more projects being able to pencil more projects getting built, which will result in overall more affordable housing and just more housing overall getting built. So the base density inclusionary program requires 50% of the adjusted base density, so that's taking the base density number and adjusting it for the allowed building envelope. 50% of it has to be affordable, and then you get 8 stories and 4.5 times the lot size as building area for the building. And that's basically the maximum size that can be built in most of LA economically with wooden construction on top of the podium. Not necessarily every development is going to maximize that size, but that is kind of the maximum that you can hit. Then the double density inclusionary program would only apply in certain areas, allows more density, and require 100% of the base density to be affordable. This is designed basically for a mass timber development, which is something that's just starting to become a thing, but we're seeing some mass timber models in the Bay Area that are actually penciling pretty well for 18, 19-story buildings. So this is designed specifically to target that model and try and bring it down to LA. That would result in a lot more housing and double the amount of affordable housing getting built than the base density inclusionary program. Basic requirements of this is on a major corridor with commercial zoning. With the double density inclusionary program, to qualify for that, you need to be in a high resource census tract, close to a transit stop, or in an area that already allows taller buildings. And then I'm not going to get into all the details of this program, but basically a lot of this is designed to make it a lot simpler and provide a lot more flexibility in the design of buildings and in what units can be provided. And the hope there is that can enable a lot more projects to actually be feasible by just having that flexibility built in instead of everything being a fight with the developer and the architect. This is a sample comparison of what you get with the density inclusionary program compared to the base density transit-oriented communities, which is the main density bonus program, and the state density bonus program. One of the big things to notice is you can see that the new state density bonus program, which goes into effect next year, sort of kills TOC in terms of you get a bit higher density, but you can get a lot more height and floor area. It's going to be a bit harder to get approval for those projects, but it's a lot easier than it used to be a couple of years ago. And I think a lot of developers are going to be going towards that, and so that's basically going to kill off TOC. Another thing looking at, and this is kind of a major point that I want to make here, is the land cost per unit. With the base density, you're never going to be building a project unless you can get really, really high rents. You're never building an apartment project with land costs that high. But then as you start adding density, you can get the land costs down. And then with the double DIP program, those land costs are pretty good. On the west side, that's going to significantly lower the cost, and that can make up for the more expensive cost of construction, potentially for higher building, and the higher inclusionary requirements there. This also leads to a lot more affordable housing. So you're going with TOC, you would get about 12 units of affordable housing, and then you go all the way up to double dip, that goes up more than 3 times to 38 units of affordable housing. One of the reasons why I have the 2 different percentages and the affordable percentages, 2 different affordable numbers, is with state housing law, cities are required to make projects by right under certain conditions if 20% is affordable. So I've incorporated that into this program where To qualify for the program, you need to have the 50% or 100% of the base density. But if you add a couple more affordable units, go over that 20% point, then reach the threshold for the state law, and it can be by right. You don't need to go through environmental reviews and all that jazz. So the last strategy I have here is small scale homeownership. So kind of jokingly calls the problem, but single family homeownership is something that is really tied in, ingrained in the DNA of Southern California. And it's not going away anywhere, right? People want to be homeowners. And in LA, there are a whole bunch of people who want to be homeowners, and just anywhere else in the country, they'd be able to be homeowners, but they're never going to be able to afford it as long as they stay in LA. And these are often like relatively high earning people. And I think it would be very popular and a good thing to enable them to be able to afford to own a home. We have the state law, SB 9, which does allow 4 units on a lot. So right now in LA, any lot, you can get 4 units, which basically how it's implemented usually ends up being a duplex in front, then 2 ADUs in back. However, because of how this interacts with our local zoning rules, you end up with some really weird size restrictions, and these are usually not going to end up being for sale units. It's really suboptimal for what we want. You end up with like 600, 800 square foot units, which is not necessarily what people want out of a single family home, and you end up with mostly rentals. We should have our own implementation to execute this better. What I propose is this first is the base single family incentive program. This is just for if you want to build 4 units on a lot in a similar fashion to SB 9, you can get some relaxed zoning standards compared to if there's just 1 unit on the lot. And then this would have a tied to this an owner occupancy requirement, not for the person who's doing the development, which is kind of a real thing tied to SB 9, but instead the person who's living in there, so it needs to be sold as a for sale house. And then they have that for 2 years, and then hopefully they would live in there longer, but if they get a temporary job out of state and need to rent it out or something, they're allowed to do that. Then I have the single family bonus program. This program increases the number from 4 to 6 homes per lot, but only if all of the homes are sold 20% under the average home price in that zip code. Affordable homeownership programs usually don't work because, especially with higher interest rates, it requires a massive subsidy. This is taking a completely different approach. This isn't truly affordable, but this is reducing the cost of homeownership in any neighborhood. So let's take a look at what that looks like. This is an example in Mar Vista, which is a very expensive West Side neighborhood. Average sale price in the neighborhood for a home is $1.7 million. Because you are buying existing homes to build these new homes, you end up, when you're going from 4 units to 6 units, you end up with much lower land costs, and that enables cheaper units. Also, when you're having more on a lot, you're probably going to have smaller units. And so in this model, have $1 million homes, which $1 million home is expensive, but it's not expensive for Mar Vista, right? There would be lines for miles out the door to buy a house for $1 million in Mar Vista. This is a cheaper example in Augusta. And under this example, the home's priced just under $600,000. And where in LA today can you get a home for $600,000? Going through the numbers of these 3 programs, it's really hard to predict actually how much development something can enable because there's so many different factors. And with interest rates right now, you can't really produce a great model of this. But I took an estimate based on what would be enabled by each program. Mid-scale infill, I think if you have about 1% of the eligible lots, they are developed each year during the planning period. We could get about 87,000 new homes built through that program. The large-scale corridors, I didn't put the total number of homes that we built, but for just the affordable homes, what ends up being about 20% of the total, it would result in about 25,000 throughout the city, and 7,000 of those would be in the west side. And then the small-scale home ownership would result in 56,000 new for-sale homes, which would actually be a 10% increase in the number of homeowners in Los Angeles, which is pretty cool. So that was part 1. Let me get a drink of water, then we'll go to part 2, which is much shorter than part 1. Let's talk about the actual production process of building homes. Home building and building dense infill multifamily is unlike the production of really anything else. When you think of manufacturing something typically, on one extreme you have like artisans building things by hand, everything is custom, everything is bespoke. Then on the other extreme you have high precision, mass manufacturing, everything is identical, sort of nothing goes wrong, or if something goes wrong often it's disastrous, but you have systems in place designed to prevent things from going wrong. With home building, you sort of have the worst of both worlds, where every project is bespoke, it's really expensive, but everything kind of has to follow the same formula, and a whole bunch can go wrong, and it's just like I said, the worst of both worlds. As I said before, we've had a housing crisis because it's too expensive, risky, and time-consuming to build housing. We've had a housing crisis before. This is not the first time we've had a housing crisis. So let's go back a bit, and we've solved the housing crisis before, in fact. So after World War II, basically, not many homes have been built in America during the Great Depression or during World War II. Almost nothing. And then during World War II, you had a whole bunch of families moving into cities. And then when World War II ended, you had all the GIs coming back. And the result was just massive overcrowding, skyrocketing rents. It was not good. And then this guy named William Levitt actually solved the problem. He invented the mass manufactured tract home. The suburbs were a concept that existed before this time, but the suburbs were like a luxury thing. You had to be pretty rich to live in the suburbs. You think about like before the Great Depression, you had to be pretty rich to own a car. The lifestyle living in the suburbs was not a working class thing. Levitt pioneered a model of mass production of almost identical tract homes on inexpensive land. He also had a second invention, which was the 30-year mortgage. He actually convinced the federal government to pass legislation subsidizing going from 10-year mortgages to, initially this was only on new housing, 30-year mortgages. Initially he was building Levittown as rental homes, enabled him to shift that from being rental homes to wholesale homes. If you take a look at what these early tract homes were like, they were very simple and had a lot of efficiency and cost-saving measures built into them. This is not like what you think of a suburban home today, right? You have shared plumbing walls, you have curtains covering closets, very small. This is around 700 square feet, and these were sold very inexpensively. I don't want to say great things about William Levitt and Levitt & Sons because there were a lot of bad parts too. I think suburbia has not been great for American, kind of a source of a lot of our problems, and also they were very racist. But I think there are lessons you can learn from the process they apply to the production of homes. One obvious one is build the same home over and over again, can save you a lot of costs. Focus on speed and labor efficiency and simplify the home designs to enable the speed and labor efficiency. MEP efficiency, so have simplified plumbing and HVAC designs that again enable production efficiency. Make the land inexpensive as possible, that's pretty obvious. Prefabricate components, but build the actual homes on site. Standardize the lots to enable the mass production. And then also, if you can convince the government to have a government-backed financing vehicle to enable this, that's also great. There's a lot of barriers to being able to implement any of this right now. Because of our zoning, the land cost per unit in LA is very high. Every project, because of zoning and building regulations, basically needs to be bespoke, started from scratch, which adds a whole bunch of costs on consultants and architects and engineers. Labor costs in Southern California are high. Don't think there's really anything we can do about that. There's years-long approval process potentially, and you also are open to environmental lawsuits on every individual project, which makes projects much riskier. Parking requirements add a huge amount of cost. One of the things William Levitt did is he never built a garage. Everything was just surface parking because he said that's just like wasted money. It's kind of interesting hearing that from one of the pioneers of single-family homes. And then the last one is we have an inflation of quality expectations where we expect things like walk-in closets and a bathroom for every bedroom and all of that. That's sort of part of the standard expectations, but that does drive up the cost of producing homes. Besides labor costs and quality standards, basically all of these are regulatory barriers. Wouldn't it be great in an ideal world if we had a pilot program that provided for reduced regulatory barriers in exchange for making the homes more affordable. Then we used that to develop a mass production model and expanded it out to get a lot more homes built a lot more quickly throughout the city. We sort of actually have that already, accidentally, thanks to the California State House and Bass administration, the programs I touched on earlier, B1G and the state density bonus, AB 20, I don't remember, but that reduces parking requirements, or removes 2345, thank you, which removes parking requirements within a half mile of major transit stops, which is actually almost the entirety of the core of the city of LA, and then streamlined approvals for unaffordable projects. Oh, I had it on the next slide. So what I want to show you today is a project I've been working on for the past 6 months, probably even a bit longer than that at this point. I'm calling Better Home. That is a model to try and build up the capacity to mass produce inexpensive homes in Los Angeles. When you think of mass production, this is something that a million startups have tried to do and they all fail. This is just like a repeated, happens every couple of years since the 1950s. One of the big reasons for this, most startups trying to do mass home production are doing modular construction, starting from the top down, starting in the factory. This approach doesn't work and is basically impossible to scale because you only really lower costs in factory production if you're producing at a high volume, but because of the site factors and because how development works on the ground, the scaling of the production on the ground and the scaling of the factory is never going to line up, and so you never are able to reach the production levels you need to actually lower costs. So it ends up being too expensive, and then when it's more expensive, why are projects on the ground going to utilize that more expensive approach? It doesn't work. Instead, my approach is starting bottom up, starting with the land. And so what I'm working with here is what I call the standard LA lot. 50 foot wide, the depth can range, but generally around 130 feet in depth, and generally either RD2, RD1.5, or R2 zoning. And with the expansion that I proposed earlier, there's about 30,000 parcels that are economically feasible to redevelop with the zoning. So starting from a point where you have a standardized lot and there's a long runway of potential lots you can build on, which could enable the scaling up of repeated building design. The base zoning here allows for 4 units. What you're seeing a lot these days are what I call these double duplexes, which are these incredibly ugly buildings. They are providing some relatively more affordable housing, so I'm not going to speak too ill of them, but they are very ugly. The land cost, when you have 4 units allowed a lot, in most not super expensive neighborhoods, it ends up being $200,000 to $400,000 per each home allowed in these lots. With the Better Home model, at the maximum feasible density for this, we're getting 27 units per lot, and so that makes the land price a much more reasonable $30,000 to $60,000 per home. The next part of this is rethinking how buildings in LA are designed. One of the big focuses with this project is on family-oriented units. Most multifamily in LA is designed for single individuals or maybe a couple with a dog. You don't really have anything that's designed for families, which is sort of a response to some regulatory barriers. And then, of course, to be able to get to mass production, my other goal here is making it more efficient to build, and also want to maximize light and open space. In Los Angeles, since the 1934 revision to our zoning code, we basically have rules that force homes into the center of the lot and sort of have an outward pressure in from the boundary of the lot. Whereas if you look at most cities around the world, a couple of exemptions like Tokyo, but most cities around the world, you basically build to the lot lines. And so you look at this building here is actually larger than this building, but it allows for way more useful open space. Because all this open space on the sides is basically wasted. You actually end up with more light to the units when you have no side setback buildings because the windows are oriented towards the front and the back, rather than most LA buildings, you end up with the majority of the windows oriented towards the side. You have 2 7-story buildings right next to each other with 5-foot setbacks. That's generally the minimum you can get with exemptions, maybe a bit larger setbacks. But those buildings are towering right next to each other. Whereas if you are having the windows on the front and courtyard, you end up with having the much wider street be the frontage for the windows, so you actually get way more light. And then even with a higher density model, because you have these insets here that go in farther than a building that is just built in the central setbacks, it actually can have the effect of overcrowding neighborhood properties less than a building that is built with setbacks. Also, is better urban design. You just get a better feel on the street when there is less setbacks between buildings. So with E1 currently and E1G, you can get exemptions from side setbacks. And so this model is designed with the expectation of being able to do that. With the proposed ordinance to make E1 permanent, they're getting rid of that. I'm kind of trying to fight against that for my project, but we'll see where that goes. Let me show you the building design. This is something that is very much a work in progress. Haven't really brought in the architect, so this has been mostly my work. So don't criticize the details too much, although I would love any feedback on the building design. You have 4 identical 3-bedroom units around the center core. I have a whole bunch of variations of this that I've worked on. This is what I've arrived at the moment. There's going to be a lot more evolution to the design, I think, but this is where we are right now. Also, don't pay too much attention to the exterior design of it. That's more of a massing study than actually what the building will look like. If we look at the floor plans, you have 3 bedrooms here, enter through the kitchen, 1.5 baths. The original design was just 1 bathroom. That was kind of like the Levitt townhomes. But feedback I got from a lot of people is you really want to have more than 1 bathroom, and so was able to adjust the design to add a 2nd half bathroom. And they're very compact, right? They're under 700 square feet, which is very small for a 3-bedroom, but it's livable. It works. And you wouldn't be able to do this small size in a double-loaded traditional building. This size is only enabled by pushing the building to the edge and providing what's called a double aspect building where there's windows on multiple sides of a unit rather than a single frontage. A side-by-side comparison, it is very similar in a lot of aspects to what early tract homes were like. Picture of the living room, picture of the kitchen and dining room. You don't get a huge amount of countertop space, but there's room here that just show shelving here, but you can fit a little counter here and end up having a pretty good cooking triangle there. Have a washer and dryer hooked up there, have room for a pretty sizable dining table over there. So it's small, but it's a very efficient, effective use of the space. There's also a lot of cost savings design, although there's going to be a lot more cost savings over time through the repetition process and gaining efficiencies and figuring out ways to save costs through building the same thing over and over. Some of the things that are cost saving measures are having the shared plumbing stack between the 2 bathrooms, doing PTAC-based HVAC system, so significantly less HVAC runs. And then there's also a lot of regulatory cost savings through B1G, ED1, and some other programs, running from having no parking saves a lot of money to having no LAHPI line extension fees, which depending on the power availability there, that can also save a lot of money. If you look right now in LA, the rent on an average 3-bedroom apartment, the figures list vary a lot, but I think this is a pretty accurate figure, around $4,400. What I think the market rent would be for a unit with this size in a building that doesn't have amenities would be about $3,200. And then with this, the rent would be eligible for households with income under $100,000. Rent would be $2,523. So that's basically some of the lowest priced 3-bedroom units that would be available anywhere in the Los Angeles region. Who is this for? Who I think is the target renter here? Using some sitcoms to illustrate. First, I think, is family, 2-income household with like 2 or 3 kids. I think design works well, something like that. Second would be like 3 roommates working minimum wage. Then the third would be a multi-generational household. And yes, the space is small for a multi-generational household, but you have thousands to tens of thousands of multi-generational families living in 1-bedroom units. And for a family living in a 1-bedroom unit, a unit like this that is not necessarily larger but has a lot more privacy is going to be vastly better for them. And I think this is going to provide them with an option that is potentially cheaper and provides a lot higher quality of living. even though it's still quite small. My vision of this is that if this works, this is a huge amount of question marks. I don't know if this is going to work. If this does work, I want to get to the point where I can scale this up to, my goal is within 5 to 10 years being able to build 10,000 homes in LA a year. Obviously there would be, when you get to that scale, there would be some more level of variation. But if you look at the LAHPI model, they within I think 3 years were at about 30,000 homes a year. They scaled up very fast. I don't think we'll be able to scale up nearly that fast, but nice goal to walk towards. And then something else I'd like to do with this is I think that getting this to work is going to require a lot of political support behind it, and I think I don't necessarily want this to be something that I would get rich off of. I think I'm really focused on getting a lot more housing, a lot more affordable housing built in LA. So what I would like to do is have this be an employee-owned company if this ends up getting to the point where he signed that. Long point until I would consider looking at that, but that's kind of what I hope to achieve for this. Thank you for coming. That's the talk.